They say the truth always comes to light, but sometimes the darkness we create consumes everything we love before that light can break through. If you're ready for a story that will haunt you long after it ends, hit that like button, subscribe for more true crime content, and comment below where you're watching from. This is the story of a mother who dug a grave for her neighbor's child and buried her own son instead. But before we dive into this twisted tale of jealousy, racism, and ultimate tragedy, let me paint you a picture of where it all began. Maple Street, population 847. The kind of suburban paradise that real estate agents dream about and horror writers use as the setting for their darkest nightmares. Tree-lined sidewalks where children ride bikes without helmets. Front porches where neighbors still wave and actually know each other's names. Barbecue smoke drifting over white picket fences on Sunday afternoons. The American dream in its purest, most Instagram-worthy form. This was the kind of neighborhood where people moved to escape the chaos of the city, where young families saved for years to afford a mortgage, where retirees came to live out their golden years in peace, where everyone believed that good things happened to good people, and evil was something that existed only in the movies or in the rough parts of town they'd left behind. But evil doesn't announce itself with warning signs. It doesn't wear a black hat or carry a pitchfork. Sometimes it wears yoga pants and drives a minivan. Sometimes it volunteers at the PTA and bakes cookies for the school fundraiser. Sometimes it lives right next door and waters its flowers every morning while plotting murder. Claire Manning moved to Maple Street in the spring of 2019 with her 5-year-old son Ethan. She was recently divorced, struggling financially, but determined to give her boy the kind of childhood she'd never had. The kind of childhood where you knew all your neighbors and felt safe walking alone after dark. Claire was 35 years old, blonde, and possessed the kind of carefully curated appearance that took 2 hours to achieve but was designed to look effortless. She wore her trauma like armor, the failed marriage, the financial struggles, the loneliness of single motherhood, and she used that armor to justify the growing resentment in her heart. You see, Claire Manning had grown up believing that life owed her something. She'd been the pretty girl in high school, the one who was supposed to marry well and live happily ever after. But life has a way of shattering fairy tale expectations, and by the time Claire reached her 30s, she was bitter, angry, and looking for someone to blame for her disappointments. That someone turned out to be Jamal Harris. Jamal had moved to Maple Street 2 years before Claire in 2017 with his 6-year-old son Malik. Unlike Claire, Jamal hadn't come to the neighborhood running from anything. He'd come because he'd earned his place there. At 38 years old, he was a respected paramedic with the local fire department, a man who dedicated his life to saving others. His colleagues called him J-Rock because of his unshakable calm under pressure and his ability to bring hope to the darkest situations. Jamal was everything Claire wished she could be but never would be. He was respected in the community not because of his appearance or his bank account, but because of his character. When Mrs. Peterson next door had a heart attack, Jamal was the first one there, performing CPR until the ambulance arrived. When the Martinez family's house caught fire, Jamal ran inside and carried out their elderly grandfather while the fire department was still en route. When Hurricane Maria refugees were relocated to their town, Jamal organized clothing drives and volunteered at the community center every weekend. And the community loved him for it. But Claire Manning saw something different when she looked at Jamal Harris. She saw a black man who had achieved everything she felt entitled to. She saw someone who had earned respect through hard work and dedication, qualities she'd never bothered to develop in herself. She saw a devoted single father whose son was confident and happy, while her own son Ethan was shy, withdrawn, and struggling to make friends. Most of all, she saw a target for all her accumulated rage and disappointment. The seeds of Claire's hatred were planted in the summer of 2019, just months after she'd moved to Maple Street. She was struggling to pay her mortgage, working 2 part-time jobs and barely keeping her head above water financially. Meanwhile, Jamal had just gotten a promotion to senior paramedic, and the whole neighborhood had turned out for his barbecue celebration. Claire watched from her kitchen window as her neighbors laughed and celebrated with Jamal in his backyard. She watched Mrs. Peterson bring him a homemade apple pie. She watched the Martinez children play with Malik like he was their beloved big brother. She watched the respect and admiration in everyone's eyes when they looked at him. And she burned with jealousy. That jealousy festered over the months that followed. Every time Jamal was featured in the local newspaper for his heroic acts as a paramedic, Claire felt the sting of his success. Every time she saw neighbors stopping to chat with him on his morning runs, she resented his popularity. Every time Malik brought home another perfect report card or won another school award, she compared him to her own struggling son and found Ethan lacking. But it was the incident at the school Christmas pageant in December 2019 that pushed Claire over the edge. Ethan had been cast as a shepherd in the nativity play, a small role that reflected his quiet personality. Malik, on the other hand, had been chosen to play Joseph, one of the lead roles. Claire sat in that auditorium, watching Malik command the stage with confidence and charisma, while her own son mumbled his single line and forgot his mark. After the performance, she watched parents congratulate Jamal on his son's performance. She heard them praise Malik's talent and poise. She saw the pride shining in Jamal's eyes as he hugged his boy. And something inside Claire Manning broke that night. The woman who had once believed she deserved the perfect life now convinced herself that Jamal Harris had stolen that life from her. In her twisted logic, his success was the reason for her failure. His happiness was the cause of her misery. His son's achievements were taking opportunities away from her son. She began to watch him obsessively. She would stand at her kitchen window every morning with her coffee, studying his routine. She learned that he left for work at 6:30 a.m. sharp. She knew he went for a run every evening at 7 p.m. She memorized his schedule, his habits, his vulnerabilities. And she began to plan. The first stage of her plan was research. Claire spent hours on her laptop, diving deep into missing children cases. She studied the patterns, the investigations, the media coverage. She learned how these tragedies unfolded, how police conducted their searches, how communities responded to the disappearance of an innocent child. She paid particular attention to cases involving false accusations, studying how panic and prejudice could override logic and evidence. She read about the Central Park Five, about Susan Smith, about countless other cases where racial bias had corrupted the pursuit of justice. Claire Manning was designing the perfect hate crime. The second stage was location scouting. She began taking long walks in the woods behind their neighborhood, ostensibly for exercise but actually mapping out the perfect spot for her crime. She needed somewhere isolated enough that no one would witness what happened, but close enough to the neighborhood that a child's disappearance would make sense. She found it 3 weeks into her search, a small clearing about half a mile into the woods, surrounded by thick trees and accessible only by a narrow trail. It was the perfect place for murder. The third stage was the most chilling: preparation. Over the course of 3 weeks in early 2020, Claire made her purchases. She bought rope from a hardware store in the next town over, paying cash. She purchased a shovel from a different store, again paying cash. She bought work gloves, a tarp, and other supplies from various locations, always careful to avoid creating a paper trail. Then, on cold February nights, when the neighborhood was asleep, Claire Manning began digging her son's grave. She worked methodically, creating a pit 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. She reinforced the sides with branches to prevent collapse. She tested different camouflage techniques until she found the perfect combination of branches and leaves that would render the pit invisible to anyone walking through the woods. It took her 12 nights to complete her death trap. On the final night, as she stood looking down into the pit that would soon claim a child's life, Claire Manning felt no remorse. She felt no doubt. She felt only satisfaction that her plan was finally coming together. She was going to murder Malik Harris and frame his father for the crime. She was going to destroy the family that had everything she wanted. She was going to watch Jamal Harris suffer the way she had suffered. But evil has a way of consuming its creator, and Claire Manning was about to learn that the universe has its own sense of justice. The day she chose for her crime was February 18, 2020, a Tuesday. She had picked the date carefully. Jamal would be working a double shift at the fire station, giving her the perfect opportunity to execute her plan without his interference. That morning, Claire woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Today was the day she would finally get her revenge. Today was the day Jamal Harris would lose everything, just as she had lost everything. She spent the morning preparing, rehearsing her story, getting her timeline perfect. She baked cookies, chocolate chip, Malik's favorite according to her careful observations, and practiced her innocent neighbor act in the mirror. At 2 p.m., she knocked on Jamal's door with her plate of fresh-baked cookies and the smile of a woman about to commit the perfect murder. "Hi, Jamal," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I was wondering if Malik might like to come over and play with Ethan this afternoon. I thought we could all use some fun after this long winter." Jamal was surprised but genuinely pleased. Despite Claire's coldness over the months since she'd moved in, he had always hoped they could be better neighbors. He was a man who believed in community, in the power of connection to heal divisions. "That's very kind of you, Claire," he said, his smile warm and trusting. "Malik would absolutely love that. He's been asking about playing with Ethan for weeks." As Malik ran to get his jacket, chattering excitedly about finally getting to play with the boy next door, he had no idea he was walking into the trap of a woman who had spent months planning his death. "Can we explore the woods, Mrs. Manning?" Malik asked as they walked toward Claire's house. My dad says there are lots of cool things to find back there. That's exactly what I was thinking, Claire replied, her heart pounding with anticipation. I know the perfect spot for an adventure. She led both boys through her backyard and into the woods, following the trail she had memorized during her weeks of preparation. Ethan, usually shy and hesitant, was animated by the prospect of adventure with his new friend. Malik chattered nonstop about school, about his dad's work, about the fort he wanted to build in the woods someday. If Claire had possessed any humanity left in her heart, she might have been moved by the innocent joy of these two children. Instead, she felt only cold determination as they approached the clearing where her death trap waited. Okay, boys, she said when they reached the spot, her voice steady despite the evil she was about to commit. I have a special game for you. It's like a treasure hunt. Both children's eyes lit up with excitement. Malik, Claire continued, pointing directly toward the concealed pit, I need you to walk over there and look for buried treasure. I hid something really special for you to find. She was pointing her finger at death, sentencing an innocent child with a gesture as casual as ordering coffee. But then something happened that Claire Manning, in all her careful planning, had never anticipated. Her own son Ethan, inspired by the prospect of finding treasure and desperate to impress his new friend, ran ahead of Malik toward the pit. Can I look for treasure too, Mommy? He called out, his 5-year-old voice bright with the kind of pure excitement that only children possess. I want to find something special too. Time slowed to a crawl. Claire saw her son running toward the death trap she had built. She saw him approaching the carefully camouflaged pit that was meant to claim someone else's child. She opened her mouth to scream a warning. No, Ethan, she cried, you stay right here, don't run. But it was too late. The branches gave way with a sickening crack that echoed through the forest like a gunshot. Ethan Manning disappeared into the pit with a scream that would haunt those woods forever. A sound of pure terror and confusion as her innocent little boy fell 6 feet down onto the rocks and debris at the bottom. Claire's own son, her baby, her reason for living, lying motionless at the bottom of the trap she had built for someone else's child. The irony was so perfect, so cruel, so absolute that it felt like the hand of God himself reaching down to deliver justice. Evil doesn't discriminate, it devours whoever gets too close, even your own child. Claire stood at the edge of the pit, staring down at Ethan's broken body. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle. His eyes were open but seeing nothing. The bright red jacket she had bought him for Christmas was already staining dark with blood. 6-year-old Malik stood frozen beside her, his young mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. This woman he had trusted, this neighbor who had seemed so kind, had just watched her own son die in a hole she had clearly dug herself. I'm scared, Malik whispered, his voice barely audible. I want my daddy. And in that moment, Claire Manning faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could confess what she had done. She could call for help. She could try to save whatever was left of her humanity by telling the truth about her evil plan and accepting the consequences. Instead, she chose to double down on her lies. Listen to me, she said, grabbing Malik by the shoulders with hands that shook with grief and rage. You need to hide right now, go deep into the woods and don't come out until your daddy finds you. And you can't tell anyone what happened here. Do you understand me? You can't tell anyone. Malik, terrified and confused, nodded frantically. He had just seen a woman watch her own son die without trying to help him. He knew, with the primal instinct that children possess, that he was in the presence of something evil. He ran deeper into the woods to hide, just as Claire had commanded, leaving her alone with the consequences of her hatred. Claire stared into the pit at her son's lifeless body for a long time. She should have felt grief. She should have felt remorse. She should have felt the crushing weight of what her evil had cost her. Instead, she felt rage. Rage at the universe for ruining her perfect plan. Rage at Malik for surviving when he was supposed to die. Rage at Jamal for being everything she could never be. Claire Manning had lost her son to her own evil, but she wasn't done destroying lives. She spent 2 hours in those woods, crafting her story, rehearsing her lies, preparing for the performance of her life. She worked on her tears, her hysteria, her broken mother act. She planned every detail of how she would frame Jamal Harris for a crime that existed only in her twisted imagination. When she finally emerged from the woods alone, she was ready to weaponize every stereotype, every prejudice, every fear that society held about black men. That evening, with tears streaming down her face, and her voice breaking with manufactured anguish, Claire Manning called 911. Please help me, she sobbed into the phone. My son is missing, someone took him, a man took my son. The 911 operator, trained to remain calm in crisis situations, began asking the standard questions. Where did you last see your son? When did you notice he was missing? Are you sure he didn't just wander off? But Claire was ready for these questions. She had spent hours preparing for this conversation. We were in the woods behind our house, she said, her voice perfectly calibrated to convey panic and grief. The boys were playing and this man came out of nowhere. He was huge, maybe 6'2", really muscular. He grabbed Ethan and ran. Can you describe this man? The operator asked. And here Claire played her trump card, the lie that would set everything else in motion. He was black, she said, letting just the right amount of fear creep into her voice. A large black man. He ran toward the Harris house when he took my son. The operator's tone changed slightly. The Harris house. Jamal Harris, Claire said, her voice now dripping with false anguish and carefully manufactured suspicion. He lives right next door to me. The lie was planted. Now it would grow like wildfire, consuming everyone in its path. Within 20 minutes, police cars were flooding Maple Street. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the force with a reputation for thoroughness, took charge of the scene. She was a woman who had seen enough tragedy to know that the most obvious explanation wasn't always the right one, but she was also human enough to be moved by a mother's tears. Claire's performance was flawless. She sobbed in all the right places. She provided just enough detail to make her story believable without over-explaining. She played the role of the devastated mother with an Oscar-worthy performance that fooled everyone who saw her. He was so big, she told Detective Rodriguez, wrapping her arms around herself as if reliving the trauma. I tried to stop him, but he was too strong. He just grabbed Ethan and ran toward Jamal's house. I think Jamal might have been involved somehow. The detective asked the obvious questions. Had Claire seen Jamal in the woods? Had there been any previous incidents between them? Was there any reason Jamal might want to hurt her or her son? Claire had prepared for these questions too. Jamal has always been strange around the children, she lied smoothly. He watches them from his yard when they play, and last week I saw him talking to Ethan by the fence. When I asked Ethan what they talked about, he seemed scared to tell me. None of this was true. Jamal had never shown anything but appropriate, friendly interest in the neighborhood children. He had never had a private conversation with Ethan. But Claire knew that in a missing child case, any suspicious behavior would be magnified, any doubt would be investigated. She was weaponizing fear itself. Within 2 hours of her call to 911, Jamal Harris was arrested. The respected paramedic who had devoted his life to saving others was dragged from his home in handcuffs while his terrified son watched from the living room window. The man who had been working a double shift at the fire station, surrounded by witnesses who could account for every minute of his time, was being accused of kidnapping and possibly murdering a child. But evidence didn't matter in the court of public opinion. Fear was stronger than facts. The media descended on Maple Street like vultures sensing carrion. News vans lined the quiet suburban street. Reporters knocked on every door, seeking quotes and background information. Camera crews set up on the sidewalk outside both Claire's house and Jamal's house, turning their private tragedy into public entertainment. The headlines wrote themselves: Local mother's nightmare, child missing after WOODS encounter, neighbor ARRESTED in disappearance. But it was the photos that did the real damage. Claire's tearful face, perfectly lit and professionally shot, appeared on every news channel and front page. She looked like America's ideal of victimized motherhood, blonde, pretty, vulnerable, and white. Jamal's booking photo, by contrast, showed a black man in handcuffs, his face grim with the knowledge that his life was being destroyed by lies. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Social media exploded with outrage. #Justice for Ethan began trending within hours. Armchair detectives dissected every detail of the case, finding sinister meaning in Jamal's choice to live in a white neighborhood, in his job as a paramedic, access to drugs and medical knowledge, in his status as a single father. Where was the mother? What was he hiding? The racist undertones were barely concealed. Comments flooded in about those people, and what did you expect? And this is why we need to be careful about who we let into our neighborhoods. Claire had successfully weaponized white women's tears and turned them into a lynch mob. Protesters gathered outside the police station and the courthouse, demanding justice for Ethan Manning. They carried signs with his kindergarten photo and chanted slogans about protecting children from predators. They had no idea they were being manipulated by the very person who had killed the child they claimed to be defending. For 3 days, Jamal Harris sat in a jail cell while his entire life crumbled around him. His colleagues at the fire station began to whisper behind his back. Parents in the neighborhood pulled their children inside when they saw his house. The man who had once been the most respected person on Maple Street had become its most hated resident. His son Malik, meanwhile, remained hidden in the woods, surviving on rainwater collected in leaves and berries he found on low-hanging branches. The 6-year-old was too terrified to come out, too traumatized by what he had witnessed to trust that anyone would believe him or keep him safe. But truth has a way of revealing itself, even when we try to bury it 6 feet deep. Detective Rodriguez was good at her job, really good. While the media circus raged and the public demanded blood, she quietly conducted the kind of thorough investigation that separates professional law enforcement from mob justice. She started with Jamal's alibi, which was ironclad. The fire station's dispatch records showed he had been on duty during the entire window when Ethan disappeared. His supervisor confirmed he had been present for all required check-ins. His partner vouched for his whereabouts minute by minute. But alibis could be fabricated, colleagues could lie, and records could be altered. Detective Rodriguez knew she needed more than paperwork to clear a suspect in a child's disappearance. So she expanded her investigation to the physical evidence. She re-examined the woods where Claire claimed the abduction had taken place. She studied the terrain, the sightlines, the possible escape routes. She interviewed every neighbor within a 2-mile radius, asking about unusual activity, strange vehicles, suspicious behavior. And she found something that made Claire's story start to crumble. Mrs. Chen, the elderly Korean war bride who lived at the edge of the woods in a house that most people had forgotten about, had something that modern investigations depend on: security cameras. Mrs. Chen had installed the cameras after a break-in attempt 2 years earlier, and they covered not just her property but a significant portion of the trail that led into the woods. The cameras were motion-activated and recorded continuously to a digital storage system that kept footage for 30 days. When Detective Rodriguez knocked on Mrs. Chen's door on the 4th day of the investigation, she wasn't expecting to find the smoking gun that would crack the case wide open. But that's exactly what she found. The footage was crystal clear. At 2:47 p.m. on February 18th, it showed Claire Manning leading 2 small children into the woods. Ethan was skipping along beside her, excited about their adventure. Malik was walking slightly behind, chattering animatedly about something the microphone couldn't pick up. At 3:23 p.m., it showed Claire Manning emerging from the woods alone. Her clothes were dirty, her hair was disheveled, her face was wild with panic and something else, something that looked less like grief and more like rage. There was no large black man, there was no abduction, there was no mysterious kidnapper. There was only Claire Manning, leading 2 children into the woods and coming back with none. The camera doesn't lie. It doesn't have prejudices or agendas or preconceived notions about who looks guilty and who looks innocent. It simply sees what is. When Detective Rodriguez confronted Claire with the footage, the woman who had seemed so confident in her lies finally began to crack. "You need to explain this to me, Claire," the detective said, sliding a photograph across the table in the police station's interview room. "This shows you leading both boys into the woods, alone, and this shows you coming back without them, alone." Claire stared at the photographs for a long moment, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a new lie to replace the old one. I was confused," she stammered. "I was in shock. The man, he must have followed us into the woods, he must have been watching us." But Detective Rodriguez wasn't buying it anymore. "Claire, there's no man in these photos. There's no one following you. It's just you and the children going in and just you coming out." "You don't understand," Claire finally screamed, her composure completely shattered. "It wasn't supposed to be Ethan, it was supposed to be." She caught herself clamping her hand over her mouth as if she could stuff the truth back inside. But it was too late. The words were out and they changed everything. "Supposed to be who, Claire?" Detective Rodriguez asked, though she already knew the answer. The truth was spilling out like blood from a wound, and there was no way to stop the bleeding. While Claire's lies unraveled in the police station, a massive search was underway in the woods. Hundreds of volunteers combed through every inch of forest, calling Ethan's name, looking for any sign of the missing boy. They found him on the 5th day, at the bottom of a carefully constructed pit that had been camouflaged with branches and debris. His little body was broken from the fall, his neck snapped on impact. The medical examiner would later determine that death had been instantaneous, a small mercy in a case with so few mercies to offer. But the discovery of Ethan's body raised more questions than it answered. The pit was clearly man-made, dug weeks or even months before the child's death. The sides were reinforced with branches to prevent collapse. The camouflage was expertly applied by someone who had spent considerable time perfecting the concealment. This wasn't a random accident. This was a deliberate trap designed to kill whoever fell into it. And as the investigation continued, they found something else that would break the case wide open. A terrified 6-year-old boy named Malik Harris, hiding in an old tree fort deep in the woods. Malik had been there for 5 days, surviving on rainwater and berries, too scared to come out even when he heard the search teams calling his name. He had witnessed something so traumatic, so unbelievable, that his young mind had simply shut down in self-preservation. When Officer Martinez finally found him, Malik was dehydrated, hypothermic, and barely conscious. But he was alive, and he had a story to tell that would finally reveal the truth about what had happened in those woods. "The lady told me to hide," Malik whispered to the child psychologist who interviewed him at the hospital. "She said not to tell anyone. She said bad things would happen if I told." "What lady, Malik?" the psychologist asked gently. "Mrs. Manning, Ethan's mommy. She made a hole in the ground and told me to walk to it, but Ethan went first and he fell in the hole she made." The words hit the investigation team like a thunderbolt. This wasn't a kidnapping. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was premeditated murder, attempted on one child and accidentally committed on another. Claire Manning had dug a grave for Malik Harris and watched her own son fall into it instead. The forensic evidence supported Malik's testimony completely. Soil samples from under Claire's fingernails matched the dirt from around the pit. Her cell phone's GPS data showed multiple trips to the woods in the weeks before Ethan's death. Store receipts found in her house revealed purchases of rope, shovels, and other supplies used in the pit's construction. Most damning of all was her internet search history, which revealed months of research into missing children cases, false accusations, and racial bias in criminal investigations. She had studied how to create the perfect hate crime, and she had nearly succeeded. The case against Claire Manning was ironclad, but by the time all the evidence came together, the damage to Jamal Harris and his family was already done. Jamal was released from jail on the 6th day, after spending nearly a week behind bars for a crime that existed only in the imagination of a racist murderer. The charges were dropped with apologies from the district attorney's office. The media that had been so quick to condemn him now offered grudging corrections buried on back pages and late-night news segments. But you can't unring a bell. You can't take back the headlines, the social media posts, the whispered conversations at school pickup lines. Jamal Harris had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, and his acquittal in the legal system couldn't restore what he had lost. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Detective Rodriguez told him as he walked out of the police station, his few possessions in a plastic bag. Jamal looked at her with eyes that had aged years in less than a week. "Sorry doesn't give me back my reputation," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "Sorry doesn't make my son feel safe again. Sorry doesn't undo what this community showed me about themselves when they were so quick to believe the worst about me." He was right, of course. The people of Maple Street had revealed their true selves during those 6 days of media frenzy. They had shown how quickly they would abandon their principles when faced with a pretty white woman's tears and a black man's mugshot. Some of his neighbors tried to apologize. They brought casseroles and flowers, offered awkward explanations about how they had been caught up in the moment, how they had never really believed he was guilty. But Jamal knew better. He had seen the fear in their eyes when he walked down the street. He had heard the whispers at the grocery store. He had watched parents pull their children closer when he approached on his morning runs. They had believed it because they wanted to believe it, because it confirmed their deepest fears and prejudices about black men in their white neighborhood, because it was easier to accept a familiar stereotype than to confront the evil that actually existed in their midst. Within a month, Jamal and Malik Harris had packed their belongings and moved away from Maple Street forever. They couldn't bear to live in a place that had been so quick to turn against them, so eager to believe a lie that fit their preconceptions. As their moving truck pulled away, taking them to a new life in a new city where maybe, hopefully, they could start over, the people of Maple Street were left to confront what they had done. But confronting uncomfortable truths has never been America's strong suit. The trial of Claire Manning became a media sensation, though for different reasons than her original lie. Now she was the villain, the racist killer who had murdered her own son in a failed attempt to frame an innocent man. The very media that had amplified her lies now dissected her motives, her planning, her cold-blooded manipulation of racial fears. The prosecution painted her as a monster who had weaponized white supremacy for personal revenge. They showed the jury her internet search history, her carefully planned purchases, her months of preparation for the perfect hate crime. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, claiming that Claire had suffered a psychotic break brought on by the stress of single motherhood and financial difficulties. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about her mental state, her history of depression, her desperate desire to find someone to blame for her life's disappointments. But the evidence was overwhelming. The premeditation was undeniable. The racist intent was clear from her own words and actions. Claire Manning was convicted of murder in the first degree for the death of her son Ethan and attempted murder for her plot to kill Malik Harris. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for the hate crime enhancement. She would die behind bars, just as she had planned for Jamal Harris to die behind bars. Justice of a sort had been served. Ethan Manning was buried on a cold March morning while his mother watched from a courthouse holding cell, shackled and dressed in orange. The funeral was small, just a few neighbors and Claire's estranged family members who had flown in from out of state. The irony was inescapable. Claire had gotten exactly what she had planned for someone else's child: a funeral, a destroyed family, and a life ruined by hate. But even with Claire behind bars and the truth finally revealed, the damage rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. The people of Maple Street tried to return to their normal lives, but the innocence was gone forever. They had learned that evil doesn't announce itself with warning signs. They had discovered that the most dangerous predators often wear familiar faces and live in beautiful houses. More importantly, they had confronted their own capacity for prejudice and mob mentality. They had seen how quickly they could abandon their principles when faced with fear and tribal thinking. Some learned from the experience. They examined their own biases, questioned their assumptions, and worked to become better people and better neighbors. Others simply moved away, unable to live with the memory of what they had revealed about themselves. The house that Claire and Ethan had called home sat empty for months, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. When it was finally sold, the new owners got it at a significant discount. No one wanted to live in the house where a mother had planned her neighbor's murder and accidentally killed her own child instead. Jamal's house sold more quickly, to a young black couple with two small children. The neighborhood held its collective breath, wondering if they had learned anything from the Harris family's ordeal. They had. The new neighbors were welcomed with genuine warmth, integrated into the community with deliberate kindness, and protected from the kind of suspicion and isolation that had made Jamal Harris's life miserable. It was a small step toward redemption, but it was something. As for Malik Harris, he and his father settled in a diverse neighborhood in another state, where Malik could go to school and make friends without carrying the weight of his traumatic experience. Jamal continued his work as a paramedic, still saving lives despite everything that had been done to him. They never spoke publicly about their ordeal. They never wrote books or gave interviews or appeared on talk shows. They simply tried to build a new life free from the shadows.